Greetings. Today we'll be dealing with the carving of the permanent mandibular lateral incisor. Now I'll be carving the right side lateral incisor. So I've put LA as labial because to differentiate it from lingual, which is L. Now since it's the right side, I'll hold it with the root down, that's the base down, and the crown up. Whatever is towards the midline, I will label it as label. What is away from the midline, will be distal. So this is the distal side. So we'll start with the carving. Same for things that we followed with the central incisor. So I'll make a line through the center of the root and the crown, crossing the incisal from the mesial side all the way on the incisal, exactly in the center. So this is my line of reference, my long axis, all the way to the distal. Now, similarly on the labial side, I'll divide the crown into three parts: cervical third, middle third, and the incisal third. So, three parts. Now, my crest of curvature in this tooth is located at this point, that is in the junction of the cervical and the middle third. So marking a line all the way almost to the central line. Now we know that when we talk of the mandibular incisors, if we look at the distal side or the mesial side, if this is the central portion where the root would be, the long axis of the root, we say the tip of the incisal tip is more towards the lingual. So this finally has to go beyond this line. So I've just brought it almost up to the line. Now this is my reference point. Keeping this down, I will just slice straight down from the distal all the way to the mesial. So this should be one clean cut all the way. So this is my first step. So you can see the crest of curvature will be here at the junction of the cervical and middle third. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to converge the tooth towards the lingual. So in the lateral incisor, the cingulum is more towards the distal side. So I'll make sure that my mesial marginal ridge will be longer than my distal marginal ridge. So I won't give so much of convergence on the distal side, but I'll give more convergence on the mesial side. So this is my marking. I'm showing the mesial side. This is the mesial marginal ridge. This will be the distal marginal ridge. We want the cingulum to be more towards the distal, so we're getting a longer mesial and a shorter distal. So place the lacrons in this point and just take it straight down. I'll extend it all the way to the labial as well. So it's a clean cut. You can see it's a clean cut this way. It's a clean cut this way. Similarly on the distal. Now distal doesn't have so much of an angulation. Okay, so you can see that It's more angulated on the mesial, less so from the distal. Taken it all the way down to the cervical. Alright. The next thing I want to do is I want to make the cingulum area. So the cingulum, I know this line has gone a little down, it's okay. Now the cingulum is located in the cervical third. So if I divide this again into 3 parts, alright. Now I'm going to remove from the lingual portion, or from the palatal portion, from the lingual portion, I'm going to remove it slightly curved. Now, when I'm doing this, I want to do something else also. Now, when we look at the incisal aspect, from the incisal aspect, we should see that the incisal ridge follows the arch form, so it curves in a distal direction. Now, if I want it to curve in a distal direction, at this stage itself, I need to remove more. When I'm giving the lingual fossa area, I need to remove more from the mesial side than from the distal. So, keeping my lacrons here, I'll remove it slightly slanting, more from the mesial than from the distal. Now, on the labial portion, I want the incisal to follow the arch form in a distal direction. So, even from the labial, now the thing that happens here is the crown is twisted over the root. That's what they describe in the theoretical part. So, to show that the crown is twisted around the root, I have to remove from this, the distal part of the labial. I have to remove it more. So, I'll give my angulation here a little more from the distal. So what you can see is from the labial side, I'm removing more in the distal aspect, while as on the lingual side, I'm removing more from the mesial aspect. Alright, now my dimension, that is from the labiopalatal or labiolingual, better term is labiolingual dimension, has to be reduced, because the dimension, when you talk of the dimension of the crown from the labial side, it is around 6.5. So the measurement here should be around 6.5 at the greatest, and at the cervical it should be 5.8. So I will measure 6.5 on my scale. Roughly, I'm marking it as 6. I'll make it 7. So this dimension should be around 7. Gradually it will reduce to 6.5. So the prominence of the cingulum can be cut off. To get it into dimension. Similarly on the labial, slightly I can take it off at the cervical portion. And then I'll again follow the more from the distal on the labial, while as from the lingual it is more from the mesial, to get the shape following the arch form. Now to make you realize better, now when we look at it from the labial aspect also, the incisal tip should slant in a distal direction. So this is my distal side. So from the mesial, I will slant it little in a distal direction. And when I do that, you can make out that this incisal tip is going in a distal direction. Now, the next thing I would do is go for the root carving. So, as per the length of the length of the root is the longest root among all the incisors. So, it's around 14 millimeters. Length of the root is 14 millimeters. So, I'll mark 14 roughly. So, you can measure it this way. Now, this is showing around, yeah, it's more than 14. So, I can take it a little higher. 14 millimeters roughly. Because we are not showing the full length here. We are not carving up to the tip of the root, because we're going to give it a feel that it has been embedded within the wax block. So now, as per the shape of the crown, this is all gross carving. Don't feel upset when you're seeing it initially. So you remove the wax as per the shape of the crown. So I'm using the pen grip method here, sorry, the palm grip. So I'm taking support and removing it. And as I always say, you can go outwards but don't go too inwards, because once you remove excess of wax, you cannot add wax back. So at the angles also, just slightly at the labial. So I'll just smoothen it slightly. So at the angles, labially, this is a mesial angle. Converge the block towards the lingual. So I've converged the root towards the lingual. So this is my rough shape now. My crown is not tapering yet. With my cervical carving, I'll do that. You can see that the incisal, from the incisal is going in a distal direction. I've got the singular more towards the distal. Now I will mark the outline of the crown. So the length of the crown is 9.5. So you can mark it 9.5 with your divider. With your divider, it should be around 9.5, so somewhere around here. Somewhere around here. So this will be my length of my crown. Length of my crown. This will be the cervical line. Now this is my line of reference. I'll take it all the way around. Now from this line on the mesial side, it dips in by around 3 millimeters. So I can further use the divider, outline 3 millimeters on the divider from my scale, and then mark it onto that portion. So around 3 millimeters I would mark off that area, and 2 millimeters on the opposite side. So on the distal it will be around 2 millimeters. So roughly, if you mark the 3 millimeter point from the cervical line coming here, goes that way, comes down back to the reference point, comes back to the reference point, and here 2 millimeters would be my outline here. Now, using my lacrons, keeping the surface flat, remove it as per the outline you have given to the 3 millimeter mark on the mesial. So it's with this cervical carving that we get the full shape of the tooth. So this is one of the important parts of the carving. So I'm removing from the labial. When I'm removing from the labial, I'm removing more from both the proximal portions, that is from the mesial as well as the distal. Now the distal outline again on the cervical. Remove more. So you're creating a ledge by removing the wax on these surfaces. Now when you look at this, you can see that the root here is much bulkier, and here it's gone in. So take your lacrons, remove it, remove the bulkiness of the root below that portion. So reducing the bulkiness of the root. If you want to, don't do it too much, because what happens, some people when they're carving the root, they end up removing excess wax, and finally the root breaks. So you can leave this up to this point, removing it from the angles also. Converging the root towards the lingual. Okay. So we're removing the root portion that is bulky below the cervical line. So I'm just taking it straight down now. I'm converging it as well lingually. So that is for my distal side. Now I will come to the mesial side. Mesial side again, you can see that it's going outwards. So remove the bulkiness. Similarly at the angles, labially. So from the label I'm going onto the mesial, from the label I'm going onto the distal. I'm not starting from the mesial and coming to the label because I don't want the root to converge towards the label. I want it to converge towards the lingual. So reduce it all the way there. Now once I've done that, so you can see the crown is sticking out from above the root. So what I will do is place my lacrons flat here towards the cervical and just remove it. So you can see that it's gradually converging towards the cervical. So place it from incisal towards the cervical so that I get the convergence. You can keep your lacrons like this also and take it. So that I get the convergence from incisal towards the cervical. Now I need to do it on the distal side also. So I'll place my lacrons flat on this and just remove it all the way around. So that I get my cervical convergence. Now just round it off slightly. Re-establish the cervical line. Just making sure that the levels of the cervical line on the label and on the palatal are at the same levels. So I'm starting with a bulky carving and gradually reducing it to the dimension. Now I'm also at the same time converging the root apically both from the mesial and the distal sides as well as from the lingual and the labial sides. Now the lingual portion is sticking out, so I'll just round it off. Rounding off the cingulum area. So again, I'm converging the root apically also, both from the distal, slightly from the palatal, and also from the mesial side. base should be smooth also. So I'm smoothing the base. From the labial side also, apically I can sort of give it a slight apical convergence. I don't want to do too much because it may end up breaking. Now, all the sharp angles, I'll sort of round it off. So starting from the labial, going on to the distal, starting from the labial, going on to the mesial, converging it lingually. So just smoothing it off, starting from the distal, going towards the lingual. Just redefining the cervical line. Now what I'll do is I'll just polish it. You should be careful because the root is thin. Now I can see that there are a lot of irregularities on the root, so I would change my lacrons to a blunt one, sort of smoothen out the surfaces. So very thin shavings. Similarly on the mesial. I can leave it a little because I need to make the developmental depressions on the root. So it's okay if there's slight irregularities. Okay, so now I'll remove all the loose wax from the cervical and I'll start beginning with my developmental depressions on the root. So on the mesial side we have a developmental depression that is relatively more broad and not so deep. It's a little shallow. That may become a little deeper as it goes to the apical third. Now on the distal side you have a more deeper developmental depression which may have a developmental groove in the center. So I'm removing from using the reverse side of the lacrons cover. I'm removing a little deeper on the distal, and into this I will make a developmental groove. So with the lacrons I just make a sort of a deeper groove there. Right? I'll just polish it. First I'll use the gauze to remove everything that's loose wax. And take your time in polishing. So with the further polishing, what will happen is whatever irregularities are there, it starts getting smoothened out. So the main irregularities need to be removed with your lacrons. And thereafter, the final finish is with your gauze piece and with your muslin cloth. my labial surface. I'm smoothing it out. My mesial surface. So now I'll just use the muslin cloth to give it a sort of a better polish. See my labial aspect, which I'm just finishing it off a little more. So this is the labial aspect. You can see that this is the mesial, this is the distal. You can see that the incisal is slanting in a distal direction. So there is a distal slant seen on the incisal. Now, if I look at the mesial, I can see that if I draw a line through the center, I can see my incisal tip has it has gone beyond that line. It's gone beyond that line, and it is more lingually placed. So the incisal tip is more lingually placed. Then, when I look at the distal side, when I compare it with the mesial side, I see that the mesial is longer, the distal is shorter. It's definitely going to be shorter because of the slant seen on the incisal towards the distal. So this is shorter here. Now you can see the cervical line here. It doesn't dip in as much, so it's about 2 millimeters here, while on this side it should be 3 millimeters. So that the length of the crown here is more than the length of the crown on the distal. You can see that the cingulum is coming outwards. Now on the lingual portion, the lingual fossa is not very prominent. So what happens on the lingual fossa is that it's just like in the central incisor, only the incisal portion there is a depression. So there is a depression on the incisal portion only. So that means that the mesial and distal marginal ridges are not prominent in this tooth, except for this small incisal area. So what we have here, when we look at it, we have a slight concavity in this area only, this incisal third only. And if you look at the incisal ridge, it follows the arch form, so it is going in a distal direction. So this is the carving of the mandibular lateral incisor, and this is of the right side. So this is of the right side with the mesial here, distal here, this is the labial, and on this side is the lingual.